Why is Christmas the holiday for the forgotten? You know, Christmas is really a time of characters and personalities. You have the Grinch, you have Santa Claus, so many people that come up, and movies that feature heroes of Christmas. But when you turn to Matthew chapter 1, in the beginning of the Christmas story in the book of Matthew, one of the things you see in the last half of the chapter is Christmas is not just a time for people who are famous, who have well off, people who will be remembered, but Christmas is a holiday for the people who are faithful and yet will be forgotten. Matthew begins his genealogy, he begins his Christmas story in a really weird way, that he doesn't begin with the birth of Jesus, but he begins his Christmas story with a genealogy. And that's because that's what Matthew's trying to do. Matthew is trying to say, hey, before we get to the birth of Jesus, we need to establish who this Jesus is. He's not just some man or some person who's being born in a manger, but Jesus is the divine, anointed King from God. And as the King, as God himself, what kind of king will he be? In the first part of this genealogy of Matthew chapter 1, we hear that Jesus is the king who gives grace to the outcast. In the second part, verses 6 through 11, we hear that Jesus is the king who gives grace to repentant sinners. Now in this third part, this last part of Matthew chapter 1, we see that Jesus is the king who gives grace to the forgotten faithful. In verses 12 through 17, there's a lot of things that stand out. One of those that stands out is we don't know who these people are. When you read these names, we know people like Zerubbabel, we know people like Joseph and Mary, but a lot of the names in the middle, in verses 13 and 14 and 15, we have no idea who these people are. But then the second thing that stands out for us is that of the people we do know, the people at the beginning of the list, like Zerubbabel in verse 12, and the people at the end of the list, like Joseph and Mary in verse 16, that those two people were faithful to God. And so what we possibly can assume is, how do we get from Zerubbabel in verse 12 to Mary and Joseph in verse 16? Well, what we understand is then that along the way, there was people who remained faithful to God and served the Lord, even though they've been forgotten. Even though the Bible doesn't record what they did, even though history hasn't put down their names and their stories, somehow in some way they continued to faithful the Lord all their lives and continued to pass on the things of God to the next generation. And so what Zerubbabel had in verse 12 when he lived wasn't lost until all the way you get to Joseph and Mary in verse 16. Not only was the line of royal succession not lost between Zerubbabel and Joseph and Mary, but the line of faithfulness to God wasn't lost between those generations too. And this is capped off by Mary. Just like in the other two sections, which emphasize women as a way of highlighting the quality of that section of the genealogy, this last part is highlighted by woman too, and that's Mary. Mary is the epitome of somebody who is faithfully following the Lord, even though she's kind of common and ordinary. Mary, as the other Gospels record, she was just a normal girl who was faithful to God, who was trying to obey God, who was trying to follow God. And in all reality, if Mary hadn't given birth to Jesus, she probably would have been forgotten because she was ordinary, she was common, she was usual. And so she is the epitome of somebody who's faithfully following the Lord, even though they are likely to be forgotten. The interesting thing about Mary, too, is he says Mary is the only woman inside this whole list that says she forgot or by whom Jesus was born, which is a linguistic connection to Genesis chapter 3, verse 15, and the language used there where it says that the seed of the woman is going to crush the serpent's heel. So we have, in this last section, a testimony of faithfulness. And that can be an encouragement to you today, because if you feel like you're somebody who kind of flies under the radar, somebody that people don't really notice, somebody who does a lot of stuff and doesn't seem to get a lot of recognition, that in Christ, what you do is recognized and remembered. You might not receive honors and rewards and a handshake and a pat on the back by people today, but if you have placed your faith in Jesus Christ, he remembers and he rewards, and one day he's going to pat you on the back and say, well done, good and faithful servant to you. The amazing thing about this line of people is even though we've forgotten them on earth, they were not forgotten in heaven. And so if you haven't placed your faith in Jesus, do that today. He is the King who gives grace to people who faithfully follow the Lord, even though they may be forgotten. And if you have placed your faith in Jesus, be encouraged by this passage that your toil for the Lord is not in vain. That each generation needs the generations before them to pass on the story of the Bible and the testimony of the Lord to them. And even though we, all of us, will one day likely be forgotten by people, we can know that we have passed on our faith to the next generation. And our work for God did not go in vain before God. That we have a reward in heaven for us. So what an awesome thing to remember this Christmas, that Jesus is not just some baby that was born, and it's not just about presents and giving to each other, but there's a reminder that Jesus being born in a manger, and to a little girl named Mary, a teenage girl named Mary, who otherwise was a completely normal Jewish girl who faithfully followed the Lord, that you and I, we may do a lot of stuff today that won't be remembered tomorrow on earth, but we serve a King who remembers what we've done for him forever. What an awesome thing to give thanks for this Christmas, this year. And if you want to place your faith in Jesus and celebrate and be a part of a King who remembers you and will remember you, comment below or message me. I'd love to help you out with that.